Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that'll completely change how you think about medieval romance. And honestly, I've been obsessed with this topic ever since I discovered that Vikings were basically the ancient world's kings of self-care. We're talking about a culture where personal hygiene wasn't just recommended, it was your literal dating strategy. Like, imagine if your shower routine determined whether you'd get married or die alone, because that's essentially what Viking society was like. These weren't the unwashed barbarians Hollywood loves to portray. They were the cleanest, most well-groomed people in medieval Europe, and it absolutely drove everyone else crazy with desire. So hit that like button if you're ready for some seriously engaging history that'll make you appreciate your skincare routine in a whole new way. And drop a comment letting me know your thoughts. I genuinely love hearing from you all, especially when we're talking about topics this unexpectedly relatable. Now grab something cozy to drink, settle in somewhere comfortable, and let's explore why Viking dating culture was simultaneously more sophisticated and more dangerous than anything we deal with today. Picture walking into a medieval European town around 900 CE, and the first thing that hits you isn't the smell of horses or cooking fires, it's the complete absence of any pleasant scents whatsoever. Most people bathed maybe once a month, if they were lucky. Teeth were optional after age 30, and deodorant wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. The average medieval European smelled like a combination of unwashed wool, rotting food, and regret. But then, a Viking ship pulls up to the harbor, and suddenly every woman in town is craning her neck to get a look at these mysterious Scandinavian visitors. Because here's what nobody tells you about Vikings. They were absolutely fanatical about personal hygiene in ways that would make modern influencers jealous. We're talking about men who bathed at least once a week, which doesn't sound impressive until you realize that made them cleaner than 99% of medieval Europe. They had special combs made from antler and bone that they carried everywhere, tweezers for precise grooming, and even ear spoons for cleaning out earwax. Archaeological evidence shows they bleached their beards with lye soap to achieve that perfect blonde look, and they lined their eyes with kohl like ancient rock stars. But the real game changer was their obsession with clean clothes and fresh breath. While most Europeans wore the same tunic until it literally fell apart, Vikings changed their linen undergarments regularly and had specific soaps for different types of fabric. They chewed on herbs and pine needles to keep their breath fresh, and some even used primitive toothpicks made from twigs. Imagine being a medieval woman who's used to men who smell like they've been dead for a week, and suddenly, here's this tall, blonde stranger who smells like pine forests and actually has all his teeth. The effect was absolutely devastating to local dating markets wherever Vikings traveled. Contemporary accounts from England and Ireland describe women literally abandoning their husbands to run off with Viking raiders, not because they were kidnapped, but because they were genuinely attracted to men who understood basic hygiene. One Irish chronicler complained that Viking men were unfairly seducing local women with their excessive cleanliness and elaborate hair arrangements. It's like if aliens landed tomorrow and they all looked like they'd just stepped out of a spa, the competition wouldn't even be fair. What makes this even more fascinating is that Viking hygiene wasn't just about attraction, it was deeply tied to their concepts of honor and social status. Being clean wasn't vanity, it was a moral obligation. Dirty hair or unkempt beards were seen as signs of laziness, poverty, or mental illness. They had specific days of the week dedicated to different grooming activities, and showing up to important social events without proper grooming was considered deeply insulting to your hosts. But here's where it gets really interesting. This obsession with cleanliness created an entire economy around beauty and self-care. Viking merchants traveled thousands of miles to trade for specific types of soap, rare oils for hair care, and precious metals for jewelry. They developed sophisticated techniques for making perfumes from local plants and imported spices. Some wealthy Vikings even had dedicated servants whose only job was maintaining their master's appearance. The psychological impact of this cultural difference can't be overstated. When you're the cleanest, best-dressed person in any room you enter, it changes how you carry yourself. Viking confidence wasn't just about their fighting skills. It was about knowing they looked good and smelled even better. They walked into foreign courts and trading posts with the swagger of people who understood that first impressions matter and that personal presentation is a form of soft power. What really blows my mind is how this connects to modern dating culture. We spend billions on skincare, hair care, and personal grooming, thinking it's some new obsession created by social media. But Vikings figured out over 1,000 years ago that taking care of yourself isn't shallow, it's strategic. They understood that attraction is often about the details, that confidence comes from feeling good about how you present yourself, and that personal hygiene is actually a form of respect for the people around you. The most beautiful part of this whole story is how it reveals something timeless about human nature. Across cultures and centuries, we're drawn to people who clearly care about themselves and put effort into their appearance. It's not about vanity or superficiality. It's about the signal that someone sends when they invest time and energy in their own well-being. Vikings understood that taking care of yourself is actually taking care of your relationships, your social standing, and your own self-respect. But this obsession with personal presentation was just the foundation for something even more sophisticated, a complex system of romantic expression that would make modern poetry slams look like amateur hour. Because once you've mastered the art of looking irresistible, you need to master the art of actually talking to the people you're trying to attract. And, trust me, what Vikings did with words was even more impressive than what they did with soap and combs. Now that we've established that Vikings were basically the ancient world's grooming influencers, let's talk about what they did once they'd achieved that perfect medieval glow-up. Because having great hygiene was just step one in the Viking dating playbook, step two was mastering the art of romantic poetry, and I'm not talking about some cheesy pickup lines scribbled on bark. We're talking about a sophisticated literary tradition that could make or break your entire romantic future. Imagine if your ability to slide into someone's DMs depended entirely on your skills as a poet, because that's essentially how Viking courtship worked. The thing that absolutely fascinates me about Viking poetry culture is how seriously they took creative expression as a form of seduction. This wasn't some optional hobby for artsy types. If you wanted to successfully court someone, you had better know how to craft verses that would make their heart skip a beat. And the standards were incredibly high. We're talking about a culture that developed complex poetic forms with intricate rhyme schemes, elaborate metaphors, and specific rules about meter and alliteration. Your average Viking teenager probably knew more about literary technique than most modern English majors. But here's where it gets really interesting. Viking love poetry wasn't just about expressing feelings. It was about demonstrating your intelligence, creativity, and cultural sophistication. The ability to compose clever verses showed that you were educated, thoughtful, and capable of the kind of wit that would make for engaging conversation throughout a long marriage. Think of it like a medieval version of showing off your personality through your social media posts. Except the stakes were much higher, and the audience was much more demanding. The nature metaphors were absolutely essential to Viking love poetry, and this requirement reveals something beautiful about their worldview. Every successful poem had to include references to natural phenomena, storms, seasons, animals, landscapes, celestial bodies. This wasn't just a stylistic choice. It reflected the Viking understanding that human emotions were part of the same cosmic forces that governed the natural world. Comparing your beloved to a summer meadow or a fierce winter storm wasn't cliché. It was connecting your personal feelings to the eternal rhythms of existence. What really blows my mind is the sophistication of these metaphorical systems. Vikings developed elaborate poetic vocabularies, where certain animals, weather patterns, and seasonal changes had specific romantic meanings. A poem comparing someone to a particular type of bird carried different implications than comparing them to a different species. References to spring storms versus autumn winds conveyed entirely different emotional messages. It was like having a secret code that only people educated in poetic tradition could fully understand. The competitive aspect of Viking poetry culture is something that would absolutely thrive in today's social media environment. Young Vikings would engage in poetic battles where they'd try to outdo each other with increasingly clever verses. These weren't just friendly competitions. Your reputation as a poet directly affected your social status and marriage prospects. Being known as someone who could craft brilliant, impromptu verses was like being verified on Twitter, except the verification process involved actual artistic skill. But the pressure to perform poetically created some genuinely beautiful art. Archaeological evidence includes love poems carved into wood and stone that are still emotionally powerful today. These weren't just functional communications. They were carefully crafted works of art designed to be treasured and remembered. Vikings understood that the effort you put into expressing your feelings was itself a form of love. Taking the time to create something beautiful for someone showed that they were worth your best creative energy. The gender dynamics of Viking poetry are particularly fascinating from a modern perspective. While men were expected to initiate courtship through poetry, women were equally skilled at poetic composition and were expected to respond with verses of their own. This created a kind of literary dialogue where couples would exchange increasingly sophisticated poems as their relationship developed. It was like having a conversation where every response had to be witty, meaningful, and artistically accomplished. What strikes me most about this tradition is how it elevated everyday romance into something approaching high art. Vikings didn't separate love from creativity, or personal relationships from cultural achievement. The same skills that made you a good poet, observation, empathy, imagination, linguistic precision, were considered essential qualities in a romantic partner. They understood that the ability to see beauty in the world and express it eloquently was actually a practical life skill that would enrich every aspect of a relationship. The educational implications of this poetry culture are staggering when you think about it. Every Viking child grew up knowing that their future happiness depended partly on their ability to master complex literary forms. This meant that even the most practical, warrior-focused families invested in their children's artistic education. Poetry wasn't seen as impractical or frivolous. It was considered as essential as learning to fight or farm. Imagine if modern dating required everyone to be genuinely good at creative writing. The psychological impact of this system on Viking relationships must have been profound. When your courtship begins with both partners demonstrating their creativity, intelligence, and emotional depth through carefully crafted art, you're starting from a foundation of mutual respect for each other's inner lives. The relationship isn't just based on physical attraction or practical considerations. It's built on genuine appreciation for your partner's mind and creative spirit. But here's the thing that really gets me. This beautiful tradition of romantic poetry came with some seriously dark consequences if you got it wrong. Because while good poetry could win you the love of your life, bad poetry could literally get you killed. And I'm not talking about dying of embarrassment from a poorly received verse. I'm talking about actual legal consequences that could end with your execution. The same culture that celebrated poetic excellence also had zero tolerance for poetic misconduct, and the line between romantic expression and criminal behavior was surprisingly thin. So, we've established that Vikings were poetic masters who could make hearts flutter with perfectly crafted verses about nature. But now we need to talk about the dark side of this romantic literary tradition. Because while good poetry could win you eternal love, bad poetry could literally end your life. And I'm not being dramatic here. We're talking about a legal system where writing the wrong kind of verse about someone could result in actual criminal charges, public humiliation, or even execution. Imagine if every bad pickup line you've ever sent could potentially land you in court, because that's essentially the reality Viking poets lived with every single day. The legal framework around Viking poetry was incredibly sophisticated and surprisingly harsh. There were specific laws governing what you could and couldn't say about someone in verse, and these weren't just social guidelines. They were enforced with the full weight of the legal system. Writing poetry that implied someone was sexually promiscuous without their consent was considered a form of character assassination that could destroy their marriage prospects and social standing. Making false claims about someone's courage, honor, or family lineage in verse was treated as seriously as perjury in a modern courtroom. But the most dangerous type of poetic misconduct was something called nith, verses that were specifically designed to bring shame, dishonor, or supernatural harm to their target. These weren't just mean poems. They were considered a form of magical attack that could actually damage someone's reputation, health, or luck. Vikings believed that words had real power, especially when crafted by skilled poets, so using that power maliciously was treated as a serious crime. It's like if we treated cyberbullying as both harassment and attempted murder, because Vikings genuinely believed that the right words could kill. The gender dynamics of these poetry laws reveal something fascinating about Viking society's approach to consent and reputation. Women had specific legal protections against unwanted poetic attention that were remarkably progressive for the medieval period. If a man wrote romantic poetry about a woman who hadn't given her consent to be courted, she could take him to court for harassment. If the poetry contained sexual imagery or implications, the penalties became even more severe. Vikings understood that unwanted romantic attention, even in artistic form, was a violation of personal autonomy. What really strikes me about this system is how it recognized that creative expression could be a form of violence. Modern discussions about the power of words and the responsibility that comes with artistic platforms would have made perfect sense to Vikings. They understood that poets had influence, that audiences believed what they heard in well-crafted verses, and that this influence came with serious ethical obligations. You couldn't just claim artistic freedom as a defense for using your skills to harm someone's reputation or emotional well-being. The enforcement mechanisms for these poetry laws were as creative as they were brutal. Public recitation of the offending verses was often part of the legal process, which meant that even bringing someone to trial for bad poetry could further damage their reputation. Punishments ranged from fines and public apologies to outlawry, being permanently banished from Viking society. In the most extreme cases, particularly for poetry that was considered magically harmful, the penalty could be death. The same culture that celebrated poetic excellence had zero tolerance for poetic abuse. But here's what's really interesting. These laws actually elevated the status of poetry by taking it seriously as a form of communication with real consequences. When society treats your art form as powerful enough to warrant legal regulation, that's actually a form of respect. Vikings didn't dismiss poetry as harmless entertainment. They recognized it as a legitimate form of discourse that could shape public opinion, influence political decisions, and affect people's lives in meaningful ways. Modern content creators dealing with platform regulations and legal consequences for their posts are experiencing something Vikings would have found completely familiar. The educational implications of these strict poetry laws were enormous. Every Viking child learned not just how to compose verses, but also how to do so responsibly. They were taught about consent, about the difference between playful teasing and harmful attack, about the responsibility that comes with artistic skill. Poetry education included ethics classes, essentially lessons about how to use your creative abilities in ways that built up your community rather than tearing it down. It's like if modern schools taught social media literacy alongside creative writing. The psychological pressure of operating under these constraints must have been intense for Viking poets. Every verse had to be carefully considered not just for its artistic merit, but for its potential legal consequences. You had to balance creativity with caution, passion with prudence, artistic ambition with social responsibility. But rather than stifling creativity, these constraints seem to have pushed Viking poets toward greater sophistication and subtlety. When you can't rely on crude insults or explicit content, you have to develop more refined techniques. What fascinates me most is how this system created a culture where words were taken seriously as actions. Vikings didn't separate speech from behavior the way we sometimes do. Saying something harmful about someone was considered as serious as doing something harmful to them. This perspective would revolutionize modern discussions about online harassment, hate speech, and the responsibility of influencers. Vikings figured out over 1,000 years ago that freedom of expression comes with corresponding obligations to use that freedom responsibly. The connection to modern cancel culture is impossible to ignore. Vikings were essentially practicing a form of social accountability where public figures, and poets were definitely public figures, could face serious consequences for using their platforms irresponsibly. The difference is that their system was formalized, predictable, and applied equally regardless of social status. You couldn't claim ignorance or hide behind anonymity. If you put your words out into the world, you owned the consequences. But the most beautiful aspect of this strict poetic legal system is how it created space for genuine artistic excellence. When everyone knows the rules and the stakes, when mediocrity isn't tolerated and harmful content is actively punished, the artists who succeed are truly exceptional. Viking poetry that survived this rigorous filtering process represents some of the most sophisticated literary achievement in medieval Europe. It's like having a creative environment where only the most skilled, most responsible, most genuinely talented artists can thrive. This brings us to something even more fascinating about Viking literary culture: the tradition of poetic combat, where skilled poets would engage in verbal warfare that could be just as devastating as physical battle. Because when you've mastered the art of crafting words that can destroy reputations and end careers, poetry becomes a weapon that requires just as much skill and courage to wield as any sword. And trust me, what Vikings did with competitive verse-making was absolutely ruthless in ways that would make modern rap battles look like polite conversation. So we've established that Viking poetry could literally get you killed if you cross the wrong lines. And now we need to talk about what happened when poets decided to weaponize their literary skills against each other. Because once you've mastered the art of crafting verses that can destroy reputations and end careers, poetry becomes a weapon that requires just as much skill and courage to wield as any sword. And what Vikings did with competitive verse-making was absolutely ruthless in ways that would make modern rap battles look like polite conversation. We're talking about verbal warfare, where the stakes were your honor, your social standing, and sometimes your actual life. The tradition of poetic combat, known as flyting or senna, was essentially the Viking version of a rap battle, except the participants were armed with centuries of literary tradition, and the legal system backed up their right to destroy each other with words. These weren't casual insult exchanges. They were formal competitions with rules, audiences, and genuine consequences for both winners and losers. Imagine if every roast battle came with the possibility that the loser might have to leave town forever, because that's essentially what Viking poetic combat could achieve. What absolutely fascinates me about these verbal duels is how they combined artistic excellence with psychological warfare. The goal wasn't just to insult your opponent. It was to craft insults so clever, so devastating, and so perfectly constructed that the audience would remember them forever. You had to demonstrate superior wit, deeper cultural knowledge, and more sophisticated understanding of poetic technique, all while systematically destroying your opponent's reputation. It's like being required to write a doctoral thesis on why someone sucks, except you have to do it in real time and make it rhyme. The psychological strategy behind these poetic battles was incredibly sophisticated. Skilled practitioners would research their opponent's family histories, personal weaknesses, and past embarrassments, then weave that information into verses that were both factually accurate and artistically brilliant. The most effective insults weren't just creative, they were true, which made them impossible to refute. Being called a coward in verse was bad enough, but being called a coward in verse, while everyone remembered that specific time you ran away from a fight, was absolutely devastating. But here's what really gets me about Viking poetic combat. The participants had to be genuinely brave to engage in it. These weren't anonymous internet trolls hiding behind screen names. These were people putting their reputations on the line in front of their entire community. Losing a flyting contest could damage your social standing for years, affect your marriage prospects, and even impact your ability to do business. You had to be confident in your skills and prepared to face the consequences if you weren't as clever as you thought you were. The competitive aspect of these poetic duels created an entire subculture of verbal athletes who trained for these encounters. Like modern fighters, prepare for matches. They would memorize vast collections of insults, practice improvisation techniques, and study their potential opponent's weaknesses. Some Vikings became famous throughout Scandinavia, purely for their ability to destroy people with words. Being known as someone who could win fighting contests was like being a celebrity, except your fame was based on your ability to verbally annihilate anyone who challenged you. The gender dynamics of poetic combat are particularly interesting from a modern perspective. While men dominated the formal fighting tradition, women were equally capable of devastating verbal attacks and were often feared for their ability to craft cutting verses. The difference was that women's poetic attacks were more likely to focus on personal character and social behavior, while men's insults often centered on courage and martial prowess. Both approaches could be equally destructive, just targeting different aspects of Viking identity. What really blows my mind is how these verbal battles served as a form of social regulation. In a culture where physical violence was common and legal systems were still developing, poetic combat provided a way to settle disputes and establish social hierarchies without necessarily resorting to bloodshed. If someone was behaving badly or overstepping their social position, a skilled poet could use fighting to publicly humiliate them back into line. It was like having a court of public opinion that operated through artistic performance. The educational value of these poetic duels cannot be overstated. Watching skilled practitioners engage in fighting was like attending a masterclass in rhetoric, cultural knowledge, and psychological strategy. Young Vikings learned about their history, their values, and their social expectations by listening to poets tear each other apart with historically accurate insults. Every verbal battle was simultaneously entertainment, education, and social commentary. The most dangerous aspect of poetic combat was how it could escalate beyond words. While fighting was supposed to be a verbal alternative to physical violence, particularly devastating insults could provoke actual fights. Accusing someone of cowardice or sexual impropriety in verse could be considered grounds for a duel, and the legal system often supported the insulted party's right to seek violent satisfaction. It's like if modern roast battles came with the understanding that really good burns might lead to actual combat. But here's what I find most beautiful about this tradition. It elevated insults to an art form. Instead of just calling someone names, Viking poets had to craft elaborate metaphors, complex wordplay, and sophisticated cultural references. Even when they were being absolutely vicious, they were creating genuine literature that demonstrated impressive artistic skill. It's like requiring every mean comment to be written at the level of Shakespeare. Suddenly, being cruel becomes a form of cultural achievement. The psychological impact of losing a major fighting contest must have been crushing. Not only were you publicly humiliated in front of your community, but you were humiliated by someone who was demonstrably more clever, more knowledgeable, and more articulate than you. The defeat wasn't just social. It was intellectual and artistic. You weren't just beaten. You were outclassed in ways that everyone could see and appreciate. What strikes me most about Viking poetic combat is how it reveals their understanding that words have real power. These weren't just games or entertainment. They were serious competitions where the stakes were genuine and the consequences lasted for years. Vikings understood that the ability to shape public opinion through clever language was a form of power that could be just as effective as physical strength or political authority. They figured out over 1,000 years ago what modern politicians and social media influencers are still learning about the relationship between rhetoric and reality. This brings us to something even more complex about Viking relationship culture, because all this sophisticated poetry and verbal combat was just the courtship phase. Once you'd successfully wooed someone with your hygiene, impressed them with your verses, and possibly destroyed a few rivals in poetic battle, you still had to navigate the actual business of getting married. And trust me, Viking marriage customs were going to make modern relationship drama look like a gentle misunderstanding. Because when your culture treats love as a political negotiation and divorce as a public declaration, every romantic decision becomes a strategic choice with consequences that could affect entire families. So, we've just explored the wild world of Viking poetry battles where words could literally kill you, and now we need to talk about what happened when all that romantic literary skill collided with the harsh realities of actually getting married. Because while Vikings had mastered the art of wooing someone with perfectly crafted verses about storm clouds and summer meadows, they still had to navigate a marriage system that treated love as a business transaction and divorce as a public performance. And honestly, what I find most fascinating about Viking marriage culture is how it managed to be simultaneously more progressive and more brutal than anything we deal with in modern relationships. We're talking about a society where women had legal rights that wouldn't be matched in most of Europe for another 500 years, but also where bride kidnapping was technically illegal, yet still happened with disturbing regularity. The thing that immediately strikes me about Viking marriage negotiations is how they were essentially medieval merger and acquisition deals. These weren't romantic ceremonies where two people pledged eternal love. They were complex financial arrangements where families negotiated everything from property transfers to political alliances. The bride price, dowry, and various forms of compensation were calculated with the precision of modern corporate lawyers, and the actual feelings of the bride and groom were often treated as interesting but ultimately irrelevant side notes. It's like if every wedding required a team of accountants and the couple getting married were just the final signatures on a very expensive contract. But here's where Viking marriage culture gets really interesting. Despite all this business-focused negotiation, women actually had significantly more legal power than their counterparts in most medieval European societies. A Viking woman could technically refuse a marriage proposal, own property independently, and even initiate divorce proceedings. The key word there is technically, because social pressure, family expectations, and economic realities often made these rights more theoretical than practical. It's like having the legal right to quit your job when your entire family's financial security depends on your salary, technically possible, but practically complicated. What really blows my mind about the Viking approach to marriage consent is how it reveals the gap between progressive laws and actual social practice. The legal codes were surprisingly advanced in recognizing women's autonomy, but the sagas are full of stories about families pressuring daughters into marriages they didn't want, or using emotional manipulation to secure advantageous alliances. It's like having excellent anti-discrimination laws on the books while discrimination continues to happen in practice. Off 24. The legal framework was there, but changing cultural attitudes took much longer. The economics of Viking marriage were absolutely fascinating from a modern perspective. The groom's family would pay a bride price to the bride's family, but the bride would also bring a dowry that remained her personal property throughout the marriage. If the marriage ended in divorce, she kept her dowry and could even claim additional compensation depending on the circumstances. This created a system where women had genuine economic incentives to maintain their independence and protect their financial interests. It's like having a prenuptial agreement that actually favored the woman's financial security. But the most progressive aspect of Viking marriage law was definitely the divorce system, which was so straightforward it would make modern divorce lawyers weep with envy. A woman could divorce her husband by simply declaring her intention 3 times in front of witnesses. No courts, no lengthy legal proceedings, no having to prove fault or abuse. The declaration itself was legally binding, and the husband had no right to contest it. Imagine being able to end a marriage with the same legal complexity as canceling a subscription service. Except the subscription service is your entire life partnership. The grounds for divorce in Viking society reveal a lot about their values and priorities. Women could divorce their husbands for physical violence, neglect, adultery, or even for refusing to have sex. Men could divorce their wives for adultery or for refusing to fulfill their household duties. What's particularly interesting is that emotional compatibility wasn't really considered. These were practical, behavior-based criteria that focused on whether each partner was fulfilling their expected role in the marriage contract. It's like having relationship standards based entirely on job performance rather than feelings. The social consequences of divorce were where things got complicated, especially for women. While divorce was legally simple, a divorced woman faced significant challenges in a society where marriage was the primary source of economic security and social status. She might keep her dowry and gain her freedom, but she also lost the protection and support that came with being part of a married household. It's like having the right to quit your job without having another job lined up. Technically empowering, but practically risky. What really gets me about Viking marriage culture is how it handled the tension between individual autonomy and family obligations. Young people were expected to prioritize their family's political and economic interests over their personal romantic preferences, but they were also given enough agency to make the system somewhat bearable. It's like being told you have to work in the family business, but you get to choose which department, and you can quit if the working conditions become intolerable. Not ideal, but better than having no choices at all. The age dynamics of Viking marriage are particularly striking from a modern perspective. Women typically married in their late teens or early 20s, while men often waited until their late 20s or 30s when they had established themselves economically. This age gap meant that husbands usually had more life experience, financial resources, and social connections than their wives, which created inherent power imbalances even within the relatively progressive legal framework. It's like starting a business partnership where one person has 10 years of experience and all the startup capital while the other person is just graduating college. The role of love in Viking marriage is something that really challenges modern assumptions about historical relationships. While marriages were arranged for practical reasons, there's plenty of evidence that couples were expected to develop genuine affection for each other over time. The sagas are full of stories about married couples who clearly cared deeply for each other, even if their relationship began as a business arrangement. It's like the difference between arranged marriages and dating apps. Both systems can lead to genuine love, but they start from very different premises. What strikes me most about the entire Viking approach to marriage is how it tried to balance competing interests in ways that modern relationships still struggle with. They wanted to protect family interests while respecting individual autonomy, ensure economic security while allowing for personal happiness, and maintain social stability while providing escape routes for unbearable situations. The solutions they came up with weren't perfect, but they were surprisingly sophisticated for a medieval society. It's like they were trying to solve the same relationship puzzles we're still working on today, just with different tools and constraints. But this relatively civilized approach to marriage negotiations and divorce proceedings existed alongside some much darker realities that reveal the limits of Viking legal protections. Because while the law said one thing about consent and women's rights, the practice of bride kidnapping shows how those legal protections could be circumvented by people willing to operate outside the system. And trust me, what we discover about the gap between Viking legal theory and Viking criminal practice is going to make every conversation about consent and coercion feel much more urgent and personal. So, we've established that Viking marriage was essentially a medieval merger and acquisition deal with surprisingly progressive divorce options. And now we need to talk about what happened when the legal protections met the harsh realities of a society where might often made right. Because while Viking law said women could refuse marriages and divorce their husbands with 3 simple declarations, the practice of bride kidnapping reveals how those legal protections could be completely circumvented by people willing to operate outside the system. And honestly, what fascinates me most about this dark side of Viking marriage culture is how it exposes the eternal tension between what societies claim to believe and what they actually tolerate when nobody's watching. We're talking about a legal framework that was centuries ahead of its time, coexisting with criminal practices that would make modern human trafficking look sophisticated. The thing that immediately strikes me about Viking bride kidnapping is how it operated in this weird legal gray area where everyone knew it was happening, but the system seemed designed to look the other way. Technically, abducting a woman for marriage was illegal under Viking law and could result in serious penalties, including outlawry or death. But in practice, if the kidnapper could hold on to his victim long enough for a marriage ceremony to take place, and especially if she became pregnant, the legal system often treated it as a fait accompli. It's like having laws against theft, but then shrugging and saying, well, if you can keep the stolen goods for 6 months, I guess they're yours now. What really gets me about this practice is how it reveals the gap between Viking legal theory and Viking social reality. The same culture that gave women unprecedented legal rights also created conditions where those rights could be completely nullified through violence. A woman might have the legal right to refuse a marriage proposal, But if someone kidnapped her and forced a ceremony, her legal options became much more limited. It's like having the right to vote, but living in a system where your ballot might get lost if you vote the wrong way. The mechanics of bride kidnapping in Viking society were disturbingly well developed, suggesting this wasn't just random criminal behavior, but an established alternative to legal marriage negotiations. Kidnappers would often target women during seasonal festivals or religious ceremonies when they were away from their family's protection. The abduction itself was usually planned like a military operation, with accomplices, escape routes, and safe houses where the victim could be held until a forced marriage ceremony could be arranged. It's like organized crime, except the crime was stealing someone's entire future rather than just their property. But here's what's really disturbing about this practice. It often involved the complicity of religious and legal authorities who were supposed to be protecting women's rights. Priests could be bribed or threatened into performing marriage ceremonies for kidnapped women, and local officials might be convinced to overlook the circumstances if the kidnapper was wealthy or politically connected. The same institutions that created progressive marriage laws were sometimes the ones helping criminals circumvent those laws. It's like having a justice system that writes beautiful legislation about equality while quietly helping rich people avoid the consequences of their crimes. The psychological impact of bride kidnapping on Viking women cannot be overstated. Even women who were never personally victimized lived with the constant awareness that their legal rights were only as strong as their family's ability to protect them. The knowledge that you could be kidnapped and forced into marriage at any time must have created a level of anxiety that would be considered traumatic by modern standards. It's like living in a society where you have the legal right to personal safety, but everyone knows that right can be violated with minimal consequences. What strikes me most about the social response to bride kidnapping is how it reveals the limitations of legal progress without cultural change. Viking law was remarkably advanced in recognizing women's autonomy, but Viking culture still operated on the assumption that women were essentially property that could be transferred between men through various means. Having progressive laws didn't automatically create progressive attitudes, and the gap between legal rights and social reality could be exploited by people willing to use violence. It's like having anti-discrimination laws in a society where discrimination is still socially acceptable. The law exists, but enforcement depends on cultural support. The economic motivations behind bride kidnapping add another layer of complexity to this practice. Kidnapping allowed men to acquire wives without paying bride prices or negotiating with families who might demand unfavorable terms. For men who couldn't afford to marry through legal channels, or whose social status made them undesirable marriage partners, kidnapping offered a way to bypass the normal economic and social barriers. It's like having a black market for relationships where the currency is violence instead of negotiation. But the most tragic aspect of bride kidnapping is how it could trap women in marriages that were not just unwanted but actively dangerous. A woman who had been kidnapped and forced into marriage had very limited options for escape, especially if she became pregnant or if her family decided to accept the situation rather than risk further violence. The same legal system that theoretically protected her right to divorce might be reluctant to intervene in cases where the marriage began with kidnapping. It's like being trapped in a contract you never signed but that everyone treats as legally binding. The response of Viking families to bride kidnapping reveals something interesting about the balance between honor and pragmatism in their culture. Some families would pursue kidnappers with violence, treating the abduction as an attack on their honor that demanded blood vengeance. But other families, especially those with limited resources or political power, might eventually accept the kidnapping and negotiate compensation after the fact. The decision often came down to whether the family thought they could win a violent confrontation and whether they could afford the economic and social costs of prolonged conflict. What really bothers me about this entire system is how it demonstrates that legal rights are meaningless without effective enforcement mechanisms. Viking women had impressive legal protections on paper, but those protections depended on social institutions that were often corrupt, biased, or simply overwhelmed. When the people responsible for enforcing the law are the same people who might benefit from ignoring it, even the most progressive legal framework becomes just an elaborate fiction. It's like having a constitution that guarantees rights, but no independent judiciary to enforce those guarantees. The long-term social consequences of tolerating bride kidnapping were probably more significant than most Vikings realized at the time. When a society allows its legal protections to be circumvented through violence, it sends a message that law is less important than power. This undermines not just women's rights, but the entire concept of legal equality and social order. It's like having a democracy where votes only count if they're backed up by the threat of force. Technically democratic, but actually just organized chaos. But here's what I find most relevant about this historical pattern. The gap between legal rights and practical reality that characterized Viking bride kidnapping is still visible in modern discussions about consent, assault, and institutional protection. We still live in societies where progressive laws coexist with inadequate enforcement, where victims are blamed for not preventing their own victimization, and where wealth and power can sometimes buy immunity from consequences. The specific crime has changed, but the underlying dynamic of legal rights being undermined by social tolerance for violence remains depressingly familiar. The most important lesson from Viking bride kidnapping isn't about medieval marriage customs. It's about the ongoing challenge of creating societies where legal protections actually protect people. Having good laws is just the first step. The harder work is building institutions and cultural attitudes that make those laws meaningful in practice. Vikings figured out how to write progressive legislation about women's rights, but they never figured out how to create a society where those rights were consistently respected and enforced. This brings us to something even more complex about Viking relationship culture: the question of how honor, reputation, and adultery intersected in ways that could literally determine whether marriages survived or ended in violence. Because while bride kidnapping showed how legal protections could be circumvented through crime, the Viking approach to infidelity reveals how even consensual relationships could become matters of life and death when they threatened the honor culture that held their society together. And trust me, what Vikings considered grounds for divorce versus grounds for murder is going to make every modern relationship argument look like a gentle disagreement about whose turn it is to do the dishes. So we've just explored how Viking legal protections could be completely circumvented through bride kidnapping and institutional corruption. And now we need to talk about something that reveals an even darker truth about medieval relationship dynamics. Because while forced marriage showed how women's legal rights could be violated through crime, the Viking approach to adultery reveals how even consensual relationships outside marriage could become matters of life and death when they threatened the honor culture that held their society together. And honestly, what fascinates me most about Viking infidelity culture is how it treated betrayal not as a moral failing, but as a political attack that demanded immediate and often violent retaliation. We're talking about a society where cheating on your spouse wasn't just breaking a promise, it was essentially declaring war on their entire family's reputation. The thing that immediately strikes me about Viking attitudes toward adultery is how completely different their priorities were from modern relationship ethics. We tend to think about infidelity in terms of emotional betrayal, broken trust, and personal hurt feelings. But Vikings approached adultery primarily as a question of honor, property rights, and social standing. The emotional damage was almost secondary to the public humiliation and the threat to family reputation. It's like if modern society cared more about how your relationship drama affected your LinkedIn profile than how it affected your actual feelings. What really gets me about the Viking legal framework around adultery is how it created completely different standards for men and women while still giving women more power than most medieval societies. A woman could divorce her husband for adultery and claim significant financial compensation, but a man who committed adultery faced relatively minor legal consequences unless the woman's family decided to pursue blood vengeance. However, a woman who committed adultery could face much more severe social and legal penalties, including potential violence from her husband's family. It's like having a justice system that acknowledges gender inequality, but still builds that inequality into the legal code. But here's where Viking adultery culture gets really complex. The concept of honor meant that being betrayed by your spouse was almost worse than being the one doing the betraying. A cuckolded husband wasn't just a victim of infidelity. He was seen as someone who had failed to control his own household and protect his family's reputation. This created enormous pressure for betrayed spouses to respond with violence, not necessarily because they were personally devastated, but because failing to respond would be seen as weakness. It's like living in a society where being cheated on is considered a personal failure that requires public retaliation to restore your credibility. The mechanics of how Viking society handled adultery accusations reveal a lot about their approach to evidence and justice. Unlike modern legal systems that require proof beyond reasonable doubt, Viking law often relied on oath-swearing, character witnesses, and trial by combat to determine guilt. If someone accused your spouse of adultery, you might end up having to fight a duel to defend their honor, regardless of whether you actually believe they were innocent. The truth was less important than the public demonstration of your willingness to defend your family's reputation. It's like having a legal system based on who's willing to fight hardest, rather than who's actually right. What really blows my mind about Viking infidelity culture is how it created this weird economy of reputation where your spouse's behavior directly affected your social and economic standing. A man whose wife was known to be unfaithful might find it harder to make business deals, form political alliances, or arrange marriages for his children. A woman whose husband was publicly unfaithful faced similar social consequences, but she also had the legal option to divorce him and claim compensation. It's like having a credit score that's determined by your spouse's behavior rather than your own financial decisions. The gender dynamics of Viking adultery law are particularly fascinating when you consider how they intersected with property rights and inheritance. A woman's adultery threatened the legitimacy of her children, and therefore the inheritance rights of her husband's family. But a man's adultery, while damaging to his wife's honor, didn't threaten the legal status of their children in the same way. This created a system where women's sexual behavior was policed much more strictly than men's, not necessarily because of moral double standards, but because of practical concerns about property and bloodlines. It's like having different rules for the same behavior based on who has more to lose financially. But here's what's really striking about Viking approaches to marital betrayal: the emphasis on public response over private resolution. Modern relationship advice focuses on communication, counseling, and working through problems privately. Viking culture demanded that betrayal be addressed publicly, often through formal legal proceedings or violent confrontation. The idea of quietly forgiving your spouse and moving on would have been seen as weakness that invited further disrespect. It's like living in a world where every relationship problem has to be resolved on social media with everyone watching and judging your response. The role of family and community in Viking adultery cases reveals how individual relationships were never really individual in their society. When someone committed adultery, it wasn't just a problem between spouses. It became a matter for extended families, local leaders, and sometimes entire communities to address. The betrayed spouse's family might demand compensation or revenge, while the adulterer's family might try to negotiate a settlement or prepare for conflict. Every infidelity had the potential to become a multi-generational feud that could affect dozens of people. It's like having relationship drama that automatically involves both sets of parents, all the siblings, and half the neighborhood. What really gets me about the Viking approach to adultery is how it reveals the tension between personal desires and social obligations that still exists in modern relationships. People then, like people now, sometimes fell in love with someone other than their spouse, or found themselves attracted to forbidden partners. But the consequences for acting on those feelings were so severe that it required enormous courage or desperation to risk an affair. It's like having the same human emotions and temptations we deal with today, but in a context where the stakes are literally life and death. The most tragic aspect of Viking adultery culture is how it could trap people in unhappy marriages with no safe way out. While divorce was technically available, the social and economic costs were often prohibitive, especially for women. But adultery was even more dangerous, potentially leading to violence, exile, or death. This created situations where people might be miserable in their marriages but unable to safely pursue happiness elsewhere. It's like being stuck in a job you hate, but knowing that quitting will ruin your career and getting fired will destroy your reputation. The psychological pressure of living under such strict sexual and social surveillance must have been enormous. Every interaction with someone of the opposite sex had to be carefully managed to avoid creating gossip or suspicion. The knowledge that a single mistake could destroy your reputation, your marriage, and potentially your life would have created a level of anxiety that modern people can barely imagine. It's like living in a panopticon, where everyone is watching everyone else for signs of moral failure. But here's what I find most relevant about Viking adultery culture: the way it demonstrates how societies can create systems that make human happiness almost impossible to achieve safely. The same honor culture that gave Vikings their reputation for courage and loyalty also created conditions where love, desire, and personal fulfillment became dangerous luxuries that most people couldn't afford. It's a reminder that social systems designed to protect some values, like family honor and social stability, can end up destroying other values, like individual autonomy and personal happiness. The most important lesson from Viking approaches to adultery isn't about medieval marriage customs. It's about the ongoing challenge of creating societies that balance individual freedom with social stability. Every culture has to figure out how to handle the tension between personal desires and collective obligations, between individual happiness and social order. Vikings chose a system that prioritized honor and stability over personal fulfillment, and the human cost of that choice is visible in every saga about forbidden love and violent revenge. What strikes me most about this entire system is how it reveals that the problems we face in modern relationships, balancing personal desires with social expectations, dealing with betrayal and forgiveness, navigating the gap between public and private life, are fundamentally human challenges that transcend any particular historical period. Vikings just dealt with these challenges in a context where the stakes were higher and the options were more limited. Their solutions weren't better or worse than ours. They were just different responses to the same eternal human dilemmas. This brings us to something even more fundamental about Viking society: the question of how gender identity and sexual roles were constructed and enforced in ways that would completely challenge modern assumptions about masculinity, femininity, and everything in between. Because while adultery revealed how Vikings policed sexual behavior within marriage, their broader attitudes toward gender and sexuality show a culture that was simultaneously more rigid and more flexible than anything we deal with today. And trust me, what we discover about Viking concepts of masculinity and honor is going to make every modern conversation about toxic masculinity look like a gentle, philosophical discussion. Alright, let's shift gears completely and talk about something that's going to blow your mind about Viking masculinity. We're moving from the complex world of marriage politics to something even more intense: the psychological warfare that Viking men waged against each other through the ultimate insult. And honestly, what I find absolutely fascinating about this topic is how it reveals that toxic masculinity isn't some modern invention. Vikings perfected it to such an extreme degree that calling someone unmanly could literally start a war. We're talking about a culture where your reputation for masculinity was so fragile that the wrong word could force you into a duel to the death just to prove you weren't weak. The thing that immediately strikes me about Viking concepts of masculinity is how they created this impossible standard that no human being could actually maintain consistently. Being considered a real man in Viking society required you to be simultaneously brave in battle, successful in business, eloquent in speech, generous with gifts, and absolutely dominant in all your personal relationships. But here's the kicker: you also had to maintain this perfect masculine performance 24/7, because even one moment of perceived weakness could destroy your reputation forever. It's like living in a world where every interaction is a test of your masculinity, and failing any test means social death. What really gets me about the specific insults that could trigger legal duels is how they reveal the deep insecurities built into Viking masculine identity. The words "argri" and "urther" were essentially the nuclear weapons of Viking insults. Calling someone these terms was accusing them of being sexually passive, cowardly, or feminine, in ways that were considered so shameful that the insulted party had no choice but to challenge you to combat. These weren't just mean names. They were accusations that struck at the very core of what Vikings believed made a man worthy of respect. It's like having insults so devastating that they're literally considered fighting words in the most literal sense possible. But here's what's really interesting about these masculine honor codes. They created a system where men were constantly policing each other's behavior in ways that must have been psychologically exhausting. Every Viking man lived with the knowledge that his peers were watching for any sign of weakness, any moment of vulnerability, any behavior that could be interpreted as unmanly. The pressure to maintain this perfect masculine facade must have been crushing, especially when you consider that showing fear, asking for help, or expressing emotional vulnerability could all be seen as evidence of feminine weakness. It's like living in a panopticon where the guards are all your friends and the crime they're watching for is being human. The legal framework around these masculinity insults reveals something fascinating about how seriously Viking society took psychological warfare. If someone called you Argri or Urther in public, you had the legal right to challenge them to holmgang, a formal duel that could end in death. But here's the twist. If you didn't challenge them, that was seen as proof that the insult was accurate. So, you were trapped in a system where you either had to risk your life fighting or accept permanent damage to your reputation. It's like being forced to choose between physical death and social death, with no third option available. What strikes me most about this entire system is how it reveals the incredible fragility of Viking masculine identity. For a culture that prided itself on strength and courage, they created a social structure where men's sense of self-worth was constantly under threat from words. The fact that verbal insults could be considered so dangerous that they warranted legal protection shows how vulnerable these supposedly tough warriors actually felt. It's like building an entire legal system around protecting people's feelings, except the feelings in question are specifically about whether you're man enough. The psychological impact of living under this kind of constant masculine surveillance must have been enormous. Every decision, every reaction, every moment of your life had to be carefully calibrated to maintain your reputation for manliness. Showing pain when injured, expressing grief when someone died, or admitting uncertainty about anything could all be interpreted as signs of weakness. It's like having to perform masculinity as a full-time job where the penalty for a bad performance is social exile or death. But here's what really blows my mind about Viking masculinity culture. It coexisted with a society that gave women significantly more legal rights than most medieval cultures. While men were trapped in these rigid masculine roles that left no room for vulnerability or flexibility, women could own property, initiate divorce, and participate in legal proceedings. It's like having a society that was simultaneously progressive about gender equality and completely toxic about masculine identity. The same culture that empowered women also created impossible standards for men that probably made genuine happiness difficult for everyone. The most tragic aspect of this masculine honor system is how it must have affected Viking men's relationships with each other. When every interaction carries the risk of being interpreted as a challenge to your masculinity, it becomes almost impossible to form genuine friendships or seek emotional support. The fear of being seen as weak would have prevented men from showing vulnerability, asking for help, or expressing the kind of emotions that actually create meaningful human connections. It's like having a social system designed to make men as isolated and emotionally stunted as possible. What really gets me about the specific nature of these masculinity insults is how they reveal Viking anxieties about sexual roles and gender performance. The worst thing you could accuse a Viking man of was being sexually passive or taking on what they considered feminine roles in any context. This wasn't just about sexual behavior. It was about a worldview that saw any form of receptivity, vulnerability, or non-dominance as fundamentally shameful for men. It's like having a culture that equated masculinity with never being in a position where someone else had power over you, which is basically impossible in any real human relationship. The connection between these masculine honor codes and Viking military culture is impossible to ignore. In a society where your primary value as a man was determined by your ability to fight and dominate others, any suggestion that you might be weak or cowardly was essentially an attack on your entire identity. The same qualities that made Vikings effective warriors, aggression, dominance, refusal to show weakness, also made them incredibly vulnerable to psychological manipulation through insults. It's like having a strength that's also your greatest weakness, where the very thing that makes you powerful also makes you easy to provoke. But here's what I find most relevant about Viking masculinity culture: the way it demonstrates how gender roles can become prisons for everyone involved. While we often focus on how traditional gender systems oppressed women, the Viking example shows how rigid masculine expectations can be just as damaging to men. When society defines manhood in such narrow terms that any deviation results in social death, you're essentially creating a system where half the population lives in constant fear of not being good enough at their assigned gender role. It's like having a society where everyone is trapped by expectations that make authentic human connection almost impossible. The most important lesson from Viking masculinity culture isn't about medieval gender roles. It's about the ongoing challenge of creating societies where people can be fully human regardless of their gender. The same insecurities, the same fears of not being man enough, the same pressure to perform masculinity perfectly still exist in modern culture. Vikings just made the stakes more explicit and the consequences more immediate. But the underlying dynamic of men policing each other's masculinity and punishing any sign of vulnerability remains depressingly familiar. What strikes me most about this entire system is how it reveals that strength and fragility aren't opposites. They're often the same thing viewed from different angles. Viking men were simultaneously the most feared warriors in medieval Europe and the most psychologically vulnerable to verbal attacks on their masculinity. Their strength was built on such a narrow foundation that it could be completely undermined by the right insult delivered at the right moment. It's a reminder that the most dangerous kind of strength is the kind that depends on never showing weakness, because that kind of strength is actually just elaborate weakness disguised as power. This brings us to something even more complex about Viking gender dynamics: the question of how women navigated a society that gave them legal rights, while also creating these impossible masculine standards for the men in their lives. Because while we've been talking about how Viking masculinity trapped men, we need to explore how women actually had more freedom and power than almost any other medieval culture. And trust me, what we discover about Viking women's rights is going to make every conversation about historical gender equality feel completely different. Now that we've established that Viking men lived under this crushing psychological pressure where being called unmanly could literally force them into life-or-death combat, let's explore the flip side of this gender coin that's going to completely blow your mind. Because while Viking men were trapped in these impossibly rigid masculine roles that left no room for vulnerability, Viking women actually enjoyed more legal rights, social freedom, and personal autonomy than women in most other medieval European societies. And honestly, what fascinates me most about this gender paradox is how it reveals that progressive women's rights and toxic masculinity aren't opposites. They can actually coexist in the same culture in ways that create their own unique forms of dysfunction. We're talking about a society where women could own property, initiate divorce, and participate in legal proceedings while their husbands were literally dying over insults about their manhood. The scope of Viking women's legal rights is genuinely shocking when you compare it to the rest of medieval Europe. While women in most Christian societies were considered legal property of their fathers and then their husbands, Viking women could own land independently, inherit property from their families, and maintain control over their personal wealth even after marriage. They could initiate divorce proceedings, represent themselves in court, and even serve as legal guardians for their children if their husbands died. It's like discovering that while most of medieval Europe was operating under legal systems that treated women as furniture, Vikings had accidentally invented something approaching gender equality. But here's where this gets really interesting. Viking women's economic independence wasn't just theoretical. Archaeological evidence shows that women regularly engaged in trade, ran businesses, and accumulated significant personal wealth. Some of the richest burial sites from the Viking Age belonged to women who were clearly powerful merchants or landowners in their own right. The smell of exotic spices and foreign textiles in these graves tells stories of women who traveled, traded, and built commercial empires that would make modern entrepreneurs jealous. These weren't just wives and mothers, they were economic powerhouses who shaped the Viking economy. What really gets me about Viking women's property rights is how they created a form of financial security that was almost unimaginable in other medieval cultures. When a Viking woman married, she brought a dowry that remained her personal property throughout the marriage. If the marriage ended in divorce or her husband's death, she kept her dowry plus any additional wealth she had accumulated. This meant that marriage wasn't necessarily a financial trap for women. It could actually be a strategic partnership that enhanced their economic position. It's like having a prenuptial agreement that's specifically designed to protect the woman's financial interests. The legal mechanisms that protected Viking women's rights were surprisingly sophisticated. Women could bring lawsuits, testify in court, and even demand compensation for various forms of mistreatment. If a husband failed to provide adequate support, committed adultery, or became abusive, his wife could not only divorce him but also claim significant financial damages. The sound of women's voices in Viking legal proceedings must have been startling to foreign visitors who came from societies where women weren't allowed to speak in public forums. These weren't just symbolic rights, they were practical tools that women regularly used to protect their interests. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Viking women's rights was their control over their own sexuality and reproductive choices. While women in most medieval societies had virtually no say in when or how often they had sex with their husbands, Viking women could actually divorce their husbands for sexual neglect or incompatibility. They also had access to various forms of contraception and abortion. And while these practices weren't openly discussed, they weren't criminalized the way they were in Christian societies. It's like having reproductive autonomy in an era when most women's bodies were considered property of their male relatives. The contrast between Viking women's legal status and their counterparts in other medieval cultures is absolutely staggering. While English, French, and German women were fighting for the right to inherit property or testify in court, Viking women were already running businesses, owning ships, and serving as political advisors to kings. Some Viking women even served as military leaders, though this was less common than popular culture suggests. The taste of this freedom must have been intoxicating for women who understood how restricted their sisters were in other parts of Europe. What's really fascinating about this gender system is how it intersected with Viking religious beliefs. Norse mythology included powerful female deities like Freyja and Frigg, who wielded significant authority and weren't subordinated to male gods. The practice of seether, a form of magic associated with prophecy and fate, was primarily the domain of women, and even male practitioners like Odin were sometimes criticized for engaging in women's work. This religious framework provided ideological support for women's authority in ways that Christianity explicitly rejected. It's like having a belief system that actually validates female power instead of explaining why women should be subordinate. But here's where the Viking gender system reveals its complexity. Women's expanded rights came with their own forms of pressure and expectation. Viking women were expected to be strong, independent, and capable of managing complex responsibilities. They couldn't rely on being protected or provided for. They had to be able to defend their own interests and make their own way in the world. This created opportunities for exceptional women to thrive, but it also meant that women who preferred more traditional roles might struggle to find their place in Viking society. It's like having a culture that empowers women but also demands that they use that empowerment in specific ways. The most striking aspect of Viking women's status is how it coexisted with the toxic masculinity we discussed earlier. While men were trapped in rigid gender roles that punished any sign of weakness, women were encouraged to be strong, assertive, and independent. This created some interesting dynamics where women might actually have more emotional freedom than men, since they weren't constantly policing their own behavior for signs of unmanliness. It's like having a society where gender equality meant that women got to be fully human while men got trapped in performance art. The educational implications of Viking women's status were enormous. Since women needed to be able to manage property, conduct business, and navigate legal systems, they received much more education than women in other medieval cultures. Many Viking women could read and write, understand complex financial arrangements, and engage in sophisticated political discussions. The feel of intellectual engagement must have been liberating for women who understood that their minds were valued as much as their reproductive capabilities. It's like having access to education not as a privilege but as a practical necessity for functioning in society. What really blows my mind about this entire system is how it demonstrates that gender equality isn't a modern invention. It's a choice that societies can make if they're willing to challenge traditional assumptions. Vikings didn't stumble into women's rights by accident. They created legal and social systems that deliberately empowered women because they recognized that women's contributions were valuable. The same culture that produced fearsome warriors also produced powerful businesswomen, skilled craftspeople, and influential political figures. It's proof that societies can be progressive about some issues while remaining problematic about others. The most important lesson from Viking women's rights isn't about medieval gender roles. It's about the ongoing challenge of creating societies where everyone can reach their full potential regardless of gender. The same questions that Vikings grappled with: how to balance individual autonomy with social stability, how to create opportunities without imposing obligations, how to respect different choices about how to live, are still central to modern discussions about gender equality. Vikings figured out some things that we're still working on, while completely failing at others that seem obvious to us. But here's what makes this story so perfectly ironic. The same culture that gave women unprecedented legal rights also created the most toxic masculine honor culture in medieval Europe. It's like they solved half the gender equation while making the other half exponentially worse. And this brings us to something even more complex about Viking gender dynamics: the question of how magic, spirituality, and gender identity intersected in ways that would completely challenge modern assumptions about masculinity and power. Because when your most powerful god practices women's magic, and your culture's spiritual leaders are mostly female, traditional gender roles start to look a lot more complicated than they first appeared. So we've established that Viking women had more legal rights than almost any other medieval culture, while their men were literally dying over insults about their manhood. And now we need to talk about something that's going to completely blow your mind about how gender roles actually worked in practice. Because the most fascinating aspect of Viking gender dynamics wasn't just the legal framework or the honor codes, it was how magic, spirituality, and gender identity intersected in ways that would make modern conversations about gender fluidity look like they're catching up to ideas Vikings figured out over 1,000 years ago. And honestly, what gets me most excited about this topic is how it reveals that the same culture that created the most toxic masculine honor system in medieval Europe also created space for gender expression that was more flexible than anything most societies have achieved since. The practice of Seidr, Norse magic focused on divination, fate-weaving, and spiritual communication, was considered fundamentally feminine work in Viking society. This wasn't just a casual association. It was so deeply gendered that men who practiced Seidr were automatically considered arger or ergi, terms that essentially meant unmanly or effeminate, in ways that could destroy their social standing. But here's where this gets absolutely fascinating. The most powerful practitioner of Seidr in all of Norse mythology was Odin himself, the chief god, who was simultaneously the ultimate masculine warrior figure and a practitioner of what everyone agreed was women's magic. It's like having a culture where the most macho deity is also openly doing things that would get regular men labeled as feminine. What really blows my mind about this divine exception is how it reveals the complexity of Viking attitudes toward gender and power. Odin learned Seidr from the goddess Freya, and the myths explicitly acknowledge that this made him vulnerable to accusations of unmanliness. In the Lokasenna, Loki actually calls Odin out for practicing feminine magic, essentially using the same insults that could get regular men killed in duels. But Odin's response isn't to deny the accusation or defend his masculinity. He just throws an even more devastating insult back at Loki. It's like watching the ultimate alpha male acknowledge that, yes, he does feminine things, and no, he doesn't care what you think about it. The archaeological evidence for gender-fluid magical practitioners is even more compelling than the mythological stories. Excavations of Viking burial sites have revealed numerous graves of people who were biologically male but buried with distinctly feminine magical tools, wooden staffs, jewelry, and even psychoactive substances like cannabis seeds that were associated with seether practice. These weren't just random burial anomalies. They represent a consistent pattern of people who seem to have lived as something other than the standard masculine warrior ideal. It's like finding archaeological proof that gender non-conforming people not only existed in Viking society, but were buried with the tools of their trade. What strikes me most about these seether practitioners is how they navigated the tension between social stigma and spiritual authority. Men who practiced seether were stigmatized and labeled as effeminate, but they were also recognized as having genuine magical power that people needed. It's like being socially marginalized for your gender expression, while simultaneously being essential to your community's spiritual well-being. The same people who might insult you for being unmanly would still come to you when they needed prophecies, healing, or magical intervention. The female practitioners of seether, known as velvas or seithkanur, occupied a completely different social position that reveals how gender shaped access to spiritual authority. These women were often revered as powerful seeresses who could communicate with spirits, predict the future, and even manipulate fate itself. They traveled between communities, were welcomed at royal courts, and wielded influence that transcended normal gender limitations. It's like having a class of women who gained social power specifically through embracing and mastering feminine spiritual practices. But here's what's really fascinating about the gender dynamics of seether. It created alternative pathways to social recognition that existed outside the normal masculine honor system. While most Viking men were trapped in rigid roles that demanded constant performance of aggressive masculinity, men who chose the path of seether could opt out of that system entirely. They faced social stigma, but they also gained access to forms of power and spiritual authority that were completely unavailable through traditional masculine roles. It's like having a society that offered multiple definitions of what it meant to be valuable and respected. The connection between seether and concepts of sexual and gender identity is something that modern scholars are still trying to fully understand. The accusations of arger or ergi that male seether practitioners faced weren't just about practicing feminine magic. They were tied to assumptions about sexual behavior, gender performance, and social roles that went far beyond simple magical practice. Some scholars suggest that male seether practitioners may have adopted feminine gender roles more broadly, not just in their magical work, but in their daily lives. It's like having a recognized social category for people who didn't fit standard gender expectations. What really gets me about this entire system is how it demonstrates that Vikings understood something about gender and spirituality that many cultures still struggle with. They recognized that different types of power required different types of people, and that the qualities that made someone effective at magic, intuition, empathy, connection to the spiritual realm, weren't necessarily the same qualities that made someone effective at warfare. Instead of forcing everyone into the same gender mold, they created space for people to specialize in different forms of social contribution. The most beautiful aspect of Viking magical gender dynamics is how they reveal the limitations of binary thinking about masculinity and femininity. Odin himself embodies this complexity. He's simultaneously the ultimate warrior god and the ultimate magical practitioner, the most masculine figure in Norse mythology, and someone who regularly engages in activities considered fundamentally feminine. He shapeshifts, practices divination, and even gives birth to an 8-legged horse while in the form of a mare. It's like having a deity who refuses to be constrained by human gender categories. The practical implications of this magical gender system were probably more significant than most Vikings realized at the time. By creating legitimate roles for people who didn't fit standard gender expectations, Viking society was able to access forms of knowledge and spiritual insight that more rigid cultures missed entirely. The same flexibility that allowed for gender-fluid magical practitioners also created space for innovation, creativity, and alternative approaches to solving problems. It's like having a culture that understood that diversity of perspective was actually a strategic advantage. But here's what I find most relevant about Viking magical gender dynamics. They prove that the relationship between gender, power, and social recognition is always more complex than it appears on the surface. Even in a culture famous for rigid masculine honor codes, there were alternative pathways to respect and influence that operated according to completely different rules. The same society that could kill you for being called unmanly also created space for people to gain power, specifically through embracing non-masculine spiritual practices. The most important lesson from Viking Seether culture isn't about medieval magic or gender roles. It's about the ongoing challenge of creating societies where people can contribute their unique talents regardless of how well they fit conventional expectations. Every culture has to figure out how to balance social stability with individual expression, how to maintain useful traditions, while making space for people who don't fit those traditions. Vikings found a solution that was simultaneously more rigid and more flexible than most modern approaches. What strikes me most about this entire magical gender system is how it reveals that strength and vulnerability, masculinity and femininity, power and submission aren't necessarily opposites. They're often different aspects of the same complex human reality. Odin's willingness to practice feminine magic didn't make him less powerful. It made him more complete. The male Seether practitioners who faced social stigma weren't weak. They were choosing a different form of strength that required enormous courage to pursue. The psychological impact of having these alternative gender pathways available must have been enormous for people who didn't fit standard expectations. Instead of being completely marginalized or forced to suppress their authentic selves, gender non-conforming Vikings could find legitimate roles that actually valued their differences. It's like having a society that understood that the people who don't fit the normal categories might be exactly the people you need for the jobs that normal categories can't handle. But the most inspiring aspect of Viking magical gender culture is how it demonstrates that even the most traditional societies can create space for radical self-expression when they recognize the practical value of diversity. Vikings didn't embrace gender fluidity because they were progressive about identity politics. They embraced it because they needed the spiritual services that gender-fluid people could provide. It's a reminder that the most lasting social changes often happen not through ideological arguments, but through practical demonstrations of value. This brings us to something completely different but equally fascinating about Viking relationship culture: the question of how same-sex relationships and sexual identity were understood in a society that was simultaneously more flexible and more rigid than anything we deal with today. Because while Seether showed how Vikings could create space for gender nonconformity, their approach to sexuality reveals even more complex attitudes about power, honor, and what it meant to be fully human in a culture obsessed with both individual freedom and social hierarchy. And trust me, what we discover about Viking attitudes towards same-sex relationships is going to challenge every assumption you've ever had about medieval sexuality. So we've just explored how Vikings created space for gender-fluid magical practitioners while maintaining the most toxic masculine honor culture in medieval Europe. And now we need to dive into something that's going to completely challenge every assumption you've ever had about medieval sexuality. Because what happens when we examine Viking attitudes towards same-sex relationships reveals a culture that was simultaneously more accepting and more brutal than anything we deal with today. And honestly, what fascinates me most about this topic is how it exposes the eternal tension between personal desire and social hierarchy that still shapes how we think about sexuality, power, and what it means to be fully human. We're talking about a society where same-sex relationships weren't forbidden, but the politics of who was on top versus who was on bottom could literally determine whether you lived or died. The thing that immediately strikes me about Viking approaches to homosexuality is how completely different their concerns were from modern debates about sexual orientation. While we tend to focus on questions of identity, acceptance, and equal rights, Vikings were primarily concerned with power dynamics and social hierarchy. They didn't care whether you were attracted to men or women. They cared about whether you were the one doing the dominating or the one being dominated. It's like having a society where your sexual behavior is judged entirely on workplace performance metrics rather than personal identity categories. What really gets me about this power-based approach to sexuality is how it reveals Viking anxieties about masculinity and control. Being the active partner in a same-sex relationship was generally acceptable and didn't threaten your masculine reputation. But being the passive partner, what they called being sanserthin or homosexually used by another man, was considered one of the most shameful accusations you could face. It's like having a sexual culture where the same physical act could be either completely acceptable or socially devastating depending on which role you played. The legal framework around these sexual accusations reveals something fascinating about how seriously Vikings took psychological warfare. Calling someone arg, rhaegar, or nithingr, terms that essentially accuse them of being sexually passive, wasn't just name-calling. These were fighting words that could legally justify challenging someone to holmgang, a formal duel that could end in death. But here's the twisted part. If you didn't challenge the accuser, that was seen as proof that the accusation was true. It's like being trapped in a system where you either have to risk your life fighting or accept permanent damage to your reputation. What strikes me most about this entire system is how it created a sexual hierarchy that mirrored Viking social and political structures. The same culture that valued dominance in warfare, business, and family relationships applied those same values to sexual behavior. Being sexually passive was equated with being weak, cowardly, and unfit for leadership in any context. It's like having a society where your bedroom behavior is considered a direct indicator of your capacity for every other form of social responsibility. But here's where Viking sexual politics get really complex. The gender dynamics created completely different rules for men and women. While male homosexuality was scrutinized and potentially dangerous depending on your role, female same-sex relationships seem to have been largely ignored by Viking law and literature. The Old Norse language didn't even have clear vocabulary to describe relationships between women. It's like having a culture so focused on masculine power dynamics that female sexuality only mattered when it intersected with male interests. The practical reality of how these sexual hierarchies played out in Viking society must have been psychologically exhausting for everyone involved. Men had to constantly police their own behavior and that of others to avoid any suggestion of sexual passivity. Every interaction carried the risk of being interpreted as a challenge to your masculine dominance. It's like living in a world where every relationship is a potential threat to your social standing, and every moment of vulnerability could be weaponized against you. What really blows my mind about this system is how it coexisted with the gender-fluid magical practices we discussed earlier. The same culture that created space for men to practice feminine magic also created sexual hierarchies that punished any form of masculine passivity. It's like having a society that was simultaneously more flexible and more rigid than anything we can imagine today. You could be a male seether practitioner and face social stigma for your spiritual choices. But you could also engage in same-sex relationships as long as you maintained the dominant role. The most fascinating aspect of Viking sexual culture is how it reveals the arbitrary nature of social taboos. The same physical acts that were acceptable in one context became shameful in another, depending entirely on power dynamics and social positioning. It wasn't the sexuality itself that mattered. It was what that sexuality said about your place in the social hierarchy. It's like having a culture where the meaning of your behavior is determined entirely by external observers rather than personal experience. The connection between Viking sexual politics and their military culture is impossible to ignore. In a society where your primary value as a man was determined by your ability to dominate others in combat, any suggestion that you might be sexually submissive was essentially an attack on your entire identity. The same qualities that made Vikings effective warriors, aggression, dominance, refusal to show weakness, also shaped how they understood and judged sexual behavior. It's like having a military mindset that extends into every aspect of personal life. But here's what I find most relevant about Viking approaches to sexuality: the way they demonstrate how sexual norms are always political. Every culture creates rules about acceptable sexual behavior that reflect and reinforce its broader power structures. Vikings just made those connections more explicit than most societies are willing to admit. Their sexual hierarchies weren't about morality or natural law. They were about maintaining social order and masculine authority. It's a reminder that sexual politics are never just about sex. They're always about who gets to have power and how that power is maintained. The most important lesson from Viking sexual culture isn't about medieval attitudes toward homosexuality. It's about the ongoing challenge of creating societies where people can express their sexuality without fear of violence or social destruction. The same dynamics that trapped Viking men in rigid sexual hierarchies still exist in modern cultures that police masculinity and punish any deviation from expected gender roles. We've changed the specific rules, but the underlying pattern of using sexual behavior to enforce social hierarchies remains depressingly familiar. What strikes me most about this entire system is how it reveals that sexual freedom and sexual oppression aren't opposites. They're often the same thing viewed from different angles. Vikings had more sexual freedom than many medieval cultures in some ways, but that freedom came with its own forms of surveillance, judgment, and potential violence. It's like having a society where you can do whatever you want, as long as you're willing to accept the consequences of other people's opinions about what you've done. The psychological impact of living under this kind of sexual surveillance must have been enormous. Every intimate relationship had to be carefully managed to avoid creating gossip or suspicion about power dynamics. The knowledge that your sexual behavior could be used as a weapon against you would have created a level of anxiety that modern people can barely imagine. It's like living in a world where your private life is always potentially public and your personal choices are always potentially political. But the most inspiring aspect of Viking sexual culture is how it proves that even the most rigid societies create space for human complexity. Despite all the rules, hierarchies, and potential violence, people still found ways to express their desires, form meaningful relationships, and create intimacy on their own terms. The same human needs for connection, pleasure, and love that drive modern relationships also drove Viking relationships, just within a very different set of constraints. This brings us to something even more fascinating about Viking relationship culture: the question of how their mythology and religious beliefs created space for sexual and gender expression that went far beyond what their social rules seemed to allow. Because while human Vikings were trapped in rigid hierarchies about sexual dominance and submission, their gods were busy demonstrating that the most powerful beings in the universe could be sexually and gender fluid without losing any of their authority. And trust me, what we discover about divine gender bending is going to make every conversation about traditional values feel completely different. So we've just explored how Viking sexual politics created hierarchies where being the dominant partner was acceptable while being passive could literally get you killed. And now we need to talk about something that's going to completely reframe how you think about divine authority and gender expression. Because what happens when we examine the mythological figures that Vikings actually worshipped reveals a pantheon of gods who were so gender fluid and sexually adventurous that they make modern discussions about identity look conservative. And honestly, what fascinates me most about this divine gender bending is how it created a religious framework where the most powerful beings in the universe regularly violated every human rule about masculinity and sexuality, while somehow maintaining their authority. We're talking about gods who could literally change their gender at will, give birth to monsters, and engage in every form of sexual behavior that would destroy a mortal Viking's reputation. The most obvious example of divine gender fluidity is Loki, who seems to have treated biological sex as more of a suggestion than a fixed reality. This isn't just about shape-shifting for practical purposes. Loki actively chose to experience life from multiple gender perspectives in ways that would have been unthinkable for human Vikings. The most famous example is when he transformed into a mare, mated with the stallion Svadilfari, and gave birth to Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse. But this wasn't presented as shameful or degrading. It was just another Tuesday in Asgard, where gods did whatever was necessary to solve problems, regardless of human gender expectations. What really gets me about Loki's gender transformations is how they reveal the arbitrary nature of the sexual hierarchies that governed human Viking society. While mortal men could be killed for being accused of sexual passivity, Loki literally becomes female, gets pregnant, and gives birth without losing any divine authority. The same culture that created the most rigid masculine honor codes also worshipped a deity who regularly violated every single one of those codes. It's like having a society where the ultimate role model is someone who does everything you're not allowed to do. But Loki wasn't the only gender-fluid deity in the Norse pantheon. Odin himself engaged in practices that would have destroyed any mortal man's reputation, particularly his mastery of seether magic, which was considered fundamentally feminine. The myths explicitly acknowledge that Odin's magical practices made him vulnerable to accusations of unmanliness. But his response wasn't to defend his masculinity, it was to embrace the power that came from transcending gender limitations. It's like watching the ultimate alpha male acknowledge that true power comes from being willing to learn from everyone, regardless of gender. The psychological impact of worshipping gender-fluid deities must have been enormous for Vikings who lived under such strict human gender codes. Every time they heard stories about Loki's transformations or Odin's magical practices, they were being reminded that the most powerful beings in existence didn't follow the same rules that governed mortal behavior. This created a fascinating tension where human society demanded rigid gender performance while divine society celebrated gender fluidity. It's like having religious leaders who preach one thing while your actual gods demonstrate something completely different. What strikes me most about these divine gender transgressions is how they were presented not as moral failures, but as expressions of superior power. Loki's ability to change gender wasn't seen as weakness or perversion. It was evidence of his magical abilities and divine nature. The same transformations that would have been shameful for humans were proof of godhood when performed by deities. It's like having a religious system where breaking human rules is actually evidence that you've transcended human limitations. The female deities in Norse mythology also demonstrated forms of power and sexuality that challenged human gender expectations. Freyja, the goddess associated with love and fertility, was also a powerful warrior who claimed half of all warriors who died in battle. She practiced seether magic and was sexually autonomous in ways that would have been scandalous for mortal women. The smell of her magical practices and the sound of her choosing which warriors to claim created a model of femininity that was simultaneously nurturing and terrifying. But here's what's really fascinating about these divine gender dynamics. They created space for Vikings to imagine alternatives to their rigid social hierarchies. While human society punished gender nonconformity, divine society rewarded it as evidence of superior power and wisdom. This must have provided psychological relief for people who struggled with the impossible demands of Viking gender performance. It's like having escape valves built into your religious system that allow you to imagine different ways of being human. The most beautiful aspect of Norse divine gender fluidity is how it reveals the limitations of human attempts to control and categorize identity. The gods regularly violated every rule that humans created about appropriate gender behavior, and their violations were presented as evidence of their divine nature rather than moral failings. This suggests that Vikings understood, at least on some level, that gender categories were human constructions rather than cosmic laws. It's like having a religious framework that acknowledges the artificial nature of social boundaries. The connection between divine gender fluidity and magical power is particularly significant. In Norse mythology, the ability to transcend gender limitations was directly linked to supernatural abilities and divine authority. This created a religious framework where gender nonconformity wasn't just tolerated, it was associated with the highest forms of power and wisdom. The feel of this divine approval must have been liberating for anyone who struggled with human gender expectations. What really blows my mind about this entire mythological system is how it coexisted with the brutal human gender hierarchies we've been discussing. Vikings could worship gods who regularly violated every human rule about gender and sexuality, while simultaneously enforcing those same rules with deadly seriousness in their own society. It's like having a cognitive dissonance so profound that you can hold completely contradictory beliefs about the same fundamental issues. The most important lesson from Norse divine gender fluidity isn't about medieval mythology. It's about the ongoing human struggle to reconcile social expectations with individual authenticity. Every culture creates rules about appropriate gender behavior, and every culture also creates stories about figures who transcend those rules. The tension between conformity and transcendence is universal, even when the specific rules and stories change. What strikes me most about these divine gender transgressions is how they demonstrate that power and vulnerability aren't opposites. They're often the same thing viewed from different angles. Loki's willingness to become female and give birth wasn't weakness. It was evidence of his ability to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. Odin's practice of feminine magic wasn't shameful. It was proof of his commitment to acquiring all forms of knowledge and power. The psychological complexity of worshipping gender-fluid deities while enforcing rigid human gender codes must have created enormous internal tension for many Vikings. How do you reconcile admiring divine figures who do things that would destroy your reputation if you did them yourself? How do you worship gods who embody everything your society tells you not to be? It's like having role models who are simultaneously inspiring and completely inaccessible. But perhaps the most inspiring aspect of Norse divine gender fluidity is how it proves that even the most rigid societies create space for imagination and possibility. While human Vikings were trapped in narrow gender roles, their gods demonstrated that identity could be fluid, power could be multifaceted, and strength could come from embracing rather than rejecting complexity. Every story about Loki's transformations or Odin's magical practices was essentially a reminder that the human rules weren't the only rules. The most beautiful truth about these mythological gender transgressions is how they reveal the eternal human longing for freedom from artificial limitations. Vikings created gods who could do everything they couldn't do, be everything they couldn't be, and express everything they couldn't express. In worshipping these deities, they were acknowledging that their social rules, while necessary for order, weren't reflective of ultimate truth or cosmic law. This brings us to something even more profound about Viking relationship culture: the question of how all these complex attitudes toward gender, sexuality, and divine authority played out in the most important social ritual of all, the wedding ceremony. Because while we've explored how Vikings thought about love, marriage, and identity, we haven't yet discovered how they actually celebrated and formalized these relationships in ways that would make modern wedding planners either weep with envy or run screaming from the complexity. And trust me, what we learn about Viking wedding customs is going to make every modern ceremony look like a simple courthouse signing. So, we've just explored how Viking gods were busy demonstrating that the most powerful beings in the universe could be sexually and gender fluid without losing any of their authority. And now we need to talk about something that's going to make every modern wedding planner either weep with envy or run screaming from the complexity. Because what happens when all these intricate attitudes toward gender, sexuality, and divine authority finally come together in the most important social ritual of Viking society reveals a wedding culture that was simultaneously more meaningful and more intense than anything we deal with today. And honestly, what fascinates me most about Viking wedding customs is how they managed to turn marriage into a legal contract, a religious ceremony, a political alliance, and a fertility ritual, all at the same time, while somehow making it feel like a celebration rather than a business transaction. We're talking about ceremonies that could last for days and required more planning than most modern corporate mergers. The thing that immediately strikes me about Viking wedding planning is how it required coordination between multiple families, religious authorities, and sometimes entire communities. These weren't intimate ceremonies where you could just show up and wing it. They were massive logistical undertakings that could take years to organize properly. The groom had to obtain an ancestral sword from his family's burial sites. The bride's family had to prepare elaborate dowries, and both sides had to negotiate everything from property transfers to guest lists. It's like planning a modern destination wedding, except the destination is a sacred grove, and half the guests are expecting you to sacrifice animals to ensure divine blessing. What really gets me about the pre-wedding rituals is how they were designed to symbolically strip away the couple's former identities before they entered their new life together. The bride had to give up her kransen, a gilt circlet that symbolized her unmarried status, and store it away for her future daughter. But this wasn't just about changing jewelry. It was about a complete psychological transformation where both partners had to let go of who they used to be. The bride would spend time in a bathhouse with hot stones and birch twigs, not just for cleanliness but for spiritual purification that would prepare her for her new role as a married woman. It's like having a spa day that's actually a religious ritual designed to fundamentally change your identity. The actual wedding ceremony itself was where all the complex attitudes we've been discussing about gender, power, and spirituality came together in the most beautiful way. The exchange of ancestral swords between bride and groom wasn't just symbolic. It represented the transfer of protection and responsibility between families. The groom would present his family sword to his bride, signifying that she was now under his protection, while the bride's family would give the groom one of their ancestral weapons, showing that he was now responsible for defending their daughter. It's like exchanging wedding rings, except the rings are deadly weapons that carry the weight of generations. But here's what's really fascinating about these sword exchanges. They created a form of gender equality within the marriage that was remarkable for medieval times. Both partners were literally armed and expected to be capable of defending themselves and their family. The bride wasn't just receiving protection. She was also being entrusted with the tools to provide protection. It's like having a wedding ceremony that doubles as a mutual defense pact, where both parties acknowledge that survival requires partnership rather than dependence. The religious aspects of Viking weddings reveal how seriously they took the spiritual dimensions of marriage. The blot, a ritual sacrifice to the gods, was performed to ensure divine blessing on the union. Animals associated with fertility deities were sacrificed: goats for Thor, sows for Freya, boars or horses for Frey too. The blood was collected and used to sprinkle the couple, literally covering them in divine blessing. It's like having a wedding ceremony where you're not just making promises to each other but actively invoking supernatural forces to support your relationship. What strikes me most about the Thor's hammer ritual is how it perfectly encapsulates Viking attitudes towards sexuality and fertility. A representation of Mjolnir would be placed in the bride's lap as she asked for Thor's blessing for healthy children. The symbolism was explicitly sexual. The hammer represented Thor's masculine power, and placing it on the bride's womb was a fertility ritual that acknowledged sexuality as a sacred force rather than something shameful. It's like having a wedding ceremony that celebrates rather than euphemizes the physical aspects of marriage. The handfasting ceremony, where the couple's hands were bound together with cords or ribbons, is actually where we get the phrase, tying the knot. But this wasn't just a cute symbolic gesture. It was a legal ritual that made the marriage binding in the eyes of both the community and the gods. The bound hands represented the intertwining of their lives and their commitment to face whatever came next as a unified partnership. It's like having a physical manifestation of the emotional and legal bonds you're creating. But perhaps the most important part of any Viking wedding was the mead ceremony, which reveals their understanding of marriage as both a legal contract and a spiritual transformation. The couple had to drink bridal ale together from a special vessel, and this act was what actually made the marriage legally binding to. The ale was usually honey-based mead, and the wedding couldn't proceed unless there was enough to last a full month because the couple had to continue drinking it throughout their honeymoon. It's like having a wedding ceremony where the reception isn't just a party. It's a month-long fertility ritual that's essential to the legal validity of your marriage. The honeymoon tradition itself reveals something beautiful about Viking attitudes toward the early stages of marriage. This wasn't just a vacation. It was a dedicated period where the couple focused entirely on each other mentally, socially, and physically, while consuming mead that was believed to enhance fertility. The entire community understood that this time was sacred, and that the couple needed to be left alone to establish their bond. It's like having a society that recognizes that successful marriages require intentional investment of time and energy from the very beginning. What really blows my mind about Viking wedding customs is how they manage to balance individual choice with family obligations in ways that modern weddings still struggle with. While marriages were arranged for political and economic reasons, the ceremonies themselves celebrated the personal relationship between the bride and groom. The rituals acknowledged both the practical realities of medieval life and the emotional needs of the people getting married. It's like having a wedding system that's simultaneously completely pragmatic and deeply romantic. The most beautiful aspect of Viking wedding culture is how it treated marriage as a transformation that affected not just the couple, but their entire extended community. The ceremonies were designed to create new kinship bonds, establish political alliances, and ensure the continuation of family lines while also celebrating love, sexuality, and personal commitment. Every ritual served multiple purposes, and every symbol carried layers of meaning that connected the personal to the political to the spiritual. It's like having a wedding ceremony that's simultaneously a legal proceeding, a religious service, a political summit, and a fertility celebration. What strikes me most about this entire wedding system is how it reveals that Vikings understood something about marriage that modern culture sometimes forgets: that successful partnerships require both practical planning and spiritual commitment. They didn't separate the business aspects of marriage from the emotional aspects. They integrated them into a single ceremony that acknowledged all the different dimensions of what it means to build a life with another person. The same culture that could be brutally practical about property rights and political alliances also created space for genuine celebration of love, sexuality, and human connection. The most important lesson from Viking wedding customs isn't about medieval marriage practices. It's about the ongoing challenge of creating rituals that honor both individual desires and community needs. Every wedding, in every culture, has to balance personal meaning with social expectations, private emotions with public commitments. Vikings found a way to create ceremonies that satisfied all these different requirements while still feeling authentic and meaningful to the people involved. But perhaps the most inspiring aspect of Viking wedding culture is how it demonstrates that even the most practical societies can create space for beauty, meaning, and celebration. Despite all the political negotiations and economic calculations, Viking weddings were ultimately about two people choosing to face the future together, supported by their community and blessed by their gods. The ceremonies were complex because marriage itself is complex. But they were also joyful because Vikings understood that building a life with someone you care about is worth celebrating. As we reach the end of our journey through Viking relationship culture, what strikes me most is how their approach to love, sexuality, and marriage reveals eternal truths about human nature. They struggled with the same tensions we face today between individual freedom and social responsibility, between personal desires and practical necessities, between the need for security and the longing for authentic connection. Their solutions weren't perfect, but they were honest about the complexity of human relationships in ways that modern culture sometimes avoids. The taste of mead and the feel of bound hands become symbols of something larger: the human capacity to create meaning through ritual, to build lasting bonds through intentional commitment, and to celebrate love even in the midst of practical concerns. Vikings proved that it's possible to be simultaneously realistic about the challenges of marriage and optimistic about its possibilities. They created a wedding culture that honored both the head and the heart, both the individual and the community, both the human and the divine. Hey everyone, we're diving into our final story tonight, and honestly, I've been saving something absolutely wild for last, because what we're about to explore is going to completely change how you think about medieval ceremonies and the power of alcohol in ancient societies. We're talking about Viking wedding customs that were so elaborate and meaningful, they make modern destination weddings look like courthouse quickies. And the most fascinating part isn't just the swords, the sacrifices, or even the month-long honeymoons. It's how Vikings turned the simple act of drinking together into the most legally binding contract you could possibly make. These weren't just parties with pretty decorations. They were complex legal proceedings disguised as spiritual celebrations where every ritual had multiple layers of meaning. So hit that like button if you're ready for some seriously engaging history about love, law, and the original tying the knot. And drop a comment letting me know your thoughts. I genuinely love hearing from you all, especially when we're talking about topics that connect ancient traditions to modern relationships. Now grab something warm to drink, settle in somewhere comfortable, and let's explore why Viking weddings were simultaneously the most romantic and most practical ceremonies in medieval history. The thing that immediately strikes me about Viking wedding planning is how it required more coordination than most modern corporate mergers. These weren't intimate ceremonies where you could just show up and wing it. They were massive logistical undertakings that could take months or even years to organize properly. The groom had to obtain an ancestral sword from his family's burial sites, which meant literally grave robbing your own ancestors with their permission. The bride's family had to prepare elaborate dowries that included everything from livestock to household goods to precious metals. And both sides had to negotiate not just the wedding details, but property transfers, political alliances, and guest lists that could include entire communities. What really gets me about the pre-wedding rituals is how they were designed to symbolically strip away the couple's former identities before they entered their new life together. The bride had to give up her cransen, a gilt circlet that symbolized her unmarried status, and store it away for her future daughter. But this wasn't just about changing jewelry. It represented a complete psychological transformation where both partners had to let go of who they used to be. The bride would spend time in a bathhouse with married women from both families, not just for cleanliness, but for spiritual purification and probably some very frank conversations about what married life would actually be like. The actual wedding ceremony itself was where all the complex attitudes we've been exploring about gender, power, and spirituality came together in the most beautiful way. The exchange of ancestral swords between bride and groom wasn't just symbolic, it represented the transfer of protection and responsibility between families. The groom would present his family's sword to his bride, signifying that she was now under his protection, while the bride's family would give the groom one of their ancestral weapons, showing that he was now responsible for defending their daughter. It's like exchanging wedding rings, except the rings are deadly weapons that carry the weight of generations and the expectation that you'll actually use them if necessary. But here's what's really fascinating about these sword exchanges. They created a form of gender equality within the marriage that was remarkable for medieval times. Both partners were literally armed and expected to be capable of defending themselves and their family. The bride wasn't just receiving protection, she was also being entrusted with the tools to provide protection. Viking women were expected to be able to use these weapons, not just display them. It's like having a wedding ceremony that doubles as a mutual defense pact, where both parties acknowledge that survival requires partnership rather than dependence. The religious aspects of Viking weddings reveal how seriously they took the spiritual dimensions of marriage. The blot, a ritual sacrifice to the gods, was performed to ensure divine blessing on the union. Animals associated with fertility deities were sacrificed: goats for Thor, sows for Freya, boars or horses for Freyr. The blood was collected in special bowls and used to sprinkle the couple, literally covering them in divine blessing. I know this sounds intense by modern standards, but Vikings understood that marriage was such a significant life change that it required supernatural intervention to succeed. What strikes me most about the Thor's hammer ritual is how it perfectly encapsulates Viking attitudes towards sexuality and fertility. A representation of Mjolnir would be placed in the bride's lap as she asked for Thor's blessing for healthy children. The symbolism was explicitly sexual. The hammer represented Thor's masculine power, and placing it on the bride's womb was a fertility ritual that acknowledged sexuality as a sacred force rather than something shameful. Vikings didn't have the same hang-ups about discussing sex that many medieval cultures did. They saw it as a natural and necessary part of life that deserved divine support. The handfasting ceremony, where the couple's hands were bound together with cords or ribbons, is actually where we get the phrase, tying the knot. But this wasn't just a cute symbolic gesture. It was a legal ritual that made the marriage binding in the eyes of both the community and the gods. The bound hands represented the intertwining of their lives and their commitment to face whatever came next as a unified partnership. The cords used were often made from materials that had special significance: hemp for strength, silk for prosperity, or wool dyed with specific colors that represented the family's hopes for the marriage. But perhaps the most important part of any Viking wedding was something that's going to completely change how you think about the relationship between alcohol and legal contracts. Because what Vikings did with their wedding drinks wasn't just celebration. It was the actual mechanism that made the marriage legally binding. And trust me, what we discover about the mead ceremony is going to make every toast you've ever given feel like amateur hour compared to the ultimate drinking ritual that could determine your entire future. Alright, so we've just unpacked the wild legal and spiritual drama of Viking weddings. And now it's time to get into the juicy part: the honeymoon that lasted a whole moon cycle. Because while modern honeymoons are all about beach selfies and brunch buffets, Vikings took this post-wedding ritual to a whole new level of commitment and symbolism. Imagine a month-long celebration where the couple was expected to drink mead every day, not just for fun, but as a sacred act that sealed their union and boosted their fertility. Picture this: the newlyweds retreating to a specially prepared space, surrounded by family and friends who respected the sanctity of this time. The smell of sweet honey mead mingling with the crisp northern air, the sound of laughter and storytelling echoing through the longhouse. The feel of warm wooden benches beneath them as they shared intimate moments, all while participating in a ritual that was as much about community bonding as it was about personal connection. Now, forget what you think you know about medieval drinking being just about getting drunk and rowdy. Because Viking mead ceremonies were carefully controlled, with specific quantities and timings designed to maximize their symbolic and practical effects, mead wasn't just a drink, it was a magical elixir believed to enhance fertility, health, and even spiritual harmony between the couple. The taste of honey and wild herbs became a daily reminder of their commitment and the blessings they sought from the gods. What makes this ritual so fascinating is how it blended the physical with the spiritual. Drinking mead together was a way to physically bind the couple, creating a shared experience that was both intoxicating and deeply meaningful. It was like a liquid contract, where every sip was a promise and every toast was a prayer for a fruitful life together. The psychological impact of this month-long honeymoon must have been profound. Imagine being newly married and having an entire community's eyes on you, supporting your union through daily rituals and celebrations. The pressure to live up to these expectations was probably intense, but so was the sense of belonging and shared purpose. It's like starting your marriage with a built-in support system that reminded you every day why you chose each other. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This mead ritual wasn't just about the couple. It was a way for the entire community to participate in the creation of new family bonds and the continuation of social order. Elders would offer blessings, storytellers would recount heroic tales, and everyone would share in the joy and responsibility of welcoming new members into the clan. The sound of communal singing and the clinking of drinking horns created a soundtrack that echoed the values and hopes of Viking society. What really blows my mind is how this tradition shows that Vikings understood the importance of intentionality in relationships. They didn't just say "I do" and hope for the best. They actively worked to build a strong foundation through rituals that connected the couple to their community, their gods, and their future. It's like having a marriage boot camp that combined spiritual practice, social bonding, and a little bit of party time all rolled into one. The educational implications of this ritual are pretty cool too. Young Vikings would learn from these ceremonies about the importance of commitment, the role of community in personal relationships, and the sacredness of fertility and family continuity. These weren't just parties, they were lessons in how to be part of something bigger than yourself, how to honor tradition while creating your own path. It's like attending a life skills workshop disguised as a month-long celebration. But here's the kicker that makes this story so perfectly relevant to our modern world. The idea of a honeymoon as a sacred, community-supported ritual is something we've largely lost. Today, Honeymoons are often private vacations focused on relaxation and romance, but Vikings saw this time as a crucial social and spiritual investment. They understood that marriage isn't just about two people, it's about families, communities, and the continuation of culture. The feel of that collective responsibility is something we could all learn from, especially in a world where individualism often overshadows connection. The most beautiful part of this whole tradition is how it reminds us that love and commitment are both deeply personal and profoundly social. Vikings didn't separate the two. They celebrated their union with rituals that honored their relationship and their place in the world. The taste of mead becomes a symbol of that balance, a sweet reminder that we're all connected through the bonds we create. So, as we raise our imaginary drinking horns to these ancient traditions, let's remember that the best relationships are those that are nurtured with intention, supported by community, and blessed by something greater than ourselves. And with that thought, let's get ready to wrap up our journey through Viking love and law, with a story that's all about sweet dreams, lasting bonds, and the power of connection. So, we've just explored this beautiful month-long honeymoon tradition where Vikings literally drank their way into married life. And now it's time to wrap up our incredible journey through Viking love, law, and everything in between. And honestly, as I sit here thinking about everything we've discovered together tonight, I'm struck by how these ancient Scandinavians figured out things about relationships that we're still trying to understand today. They created a culture that was simultaneously brutal and tender, practical and romantic, rigid and surprisingly flexible. It's like they understood that love isn't simple, that relationships require both passion and planning, and that the best partnerships are built on foundations of mutual respect, shared responsibility, and genuine commitment to each other's growth. What really gets me about this entire Viking relationship journey is how it reveals that the challenges we face in modern love aren't new at all. Vikings dealt with arranged marriages versus personal choice, the tension between individual desires and family expectations, the complexity of gender roles and sexual identity, and the eternal question of how to balance romance with practical reality. They just did it all with swords, mead, and a legal system that could literally kill you for writing bad poetry. But the underlying human experiences, the longing for connection, the fear of vulnerability, the hope for lasting partnership, those are exactly the same feelings that drive our relationships today. The most beautiful thing about Viking love culture is how it proves that humans have always been willing to create elaborate rituals and complex systems just to celebrate the simple act of choosing to build a life with another person. Whether it's exchanging ancestral swords or exchanging wedding rings, whether it's drinking mead for a month or going on a honeymoon cruise, whether it's writing nature, poetry, or sliding into someone's DMs, we're all just trying to figure out how to express the inexpressible feeling of wanting to share our lives with someone special. The tools change, but the heart remains the same. What strikes me most about everything we've explored tonight is how Vikings understood that love exists within systems, legal systems, social systems, economic systems, spiritual systems. They didn't pretend that relationships happen in a vacuum or that love conquers all without any practical support. Instead, they built elaborate frameworks designed to help couples succeed, from the detailed marriage negotiations that ensured financial security to the community-supported honeymoon rituals that gave new marriages the best possible start. It's like they figured out that the most romantic thing you can do is create conditions where love can actually thrive. The gender dynamics we've explored reveal something profound about the ongoing human struggle to balance equality with difference, autonomy with connection, individual identity with partnership. Vikings created a system where women had more legal rights than most medieval cultures, while men were trapped in impossible masculine performance standards. They worshipped gender-fluid gods while enforcing rigid human gender hierarchies. They celebrated divine beings who violated every social rule while punishing mortals who stepped outside prescribed roles. It's like they understood that the tension between freedom and structure is eternal, and that every society has to find its own imperfect balance. But perhaps the most important lesson from our Viking relationship journey is how it demonstrates that love is always political, always social, always connected to larger questions about power, justice, and what kind of world we want to create together. The same culture that produced beautiful wedding ceremonies also produced bride kidnapping. The same legal system that protected women's property rights also created honor codes that could kill men for being called unmanly. The same society that celebrated divine gender fluidity also enforced brutal human sexual hierarchies. Vikings remind us that progress isn't linear, that societies can be advanced in some ways while remaining problematic in others, and that the work of creating just and loving communities is never finished. What really moves me about this entire exploration is how it reveals the incredible creativity and resilience of human beings when it comes to love. Despite all the constraints, dangers, and complications of Viking society, people still found ways to express affection, create intimacy, and build meaningful partnerships. They wrote poetry that could get them killed. They practiced magic that challenged social norms. They created wedding rituals that honored both practical needs and spiritual longings. Even in the most difficult circumstances, humans find ways to love and be loved, to connect and create meaning together. The taste of mead and the feel of bound hands become symbols of something larger, the human capacity to create sacred moments out of ordinary materials, to transform simple acts into profound commitments, to build lasting bonds through intentional ritual and genuine care. Vikings understood that love isn't just a feeling, it's a practice that requires skill, dedication, and community support to flourish. They created systems designed to help people succeed at the most important work of human life, learning to love and be loved well. As we reach the end of our journey together, I'm filled with gratitude for the opportunity to explore these ancient stories and discover their modern relevance. Vikings teach us that relationships are both deeply personal and profoundly social, that love requires both passion and pragmatism, that the best partnerships are built on foundations of mutual respect, shared values, and genuine commitment to each other's well-being. They remind us that every generation has to figure out how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, how to honor tradition while creating space for innovation, how to build systems that support love rather than constrain it. The most beautiful truth from our Viking love story is that despite all the historical distance, cultural differences, and changed circumstances, the fundamental human experiences of attraction, commitment, heartbreak, and hope remain remarkably constant. We're all still writing love poetry in our own ways, still negotiating the balance between independence and partnership, still trying to create relationships that honor both our individual authenticity and our shared humanity. The Vikings just did it with more swords and significantly more mead. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that you're part of an ancient tradition of humans who've always believed that love is worth celebrating, that commitment is worth honoring, and that the work of building meaningful relationships is among the most important things we can do with our brief time on this earth. Whether you're single and searching, partnered and committed, or somewhere in between, you carry within you the same capacity for love, growth, and connection that has driven human relationships for thousands of years. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers, and may your own love stories be filled with the same courage, creativity, and commitment that made Viking relationships so enduringly fascinating. The tools may change, but the heart remains eternal.